Handle splatter. One didn't get far in the job without a strong stomach. He could have handled splatter, but the devastation came in the neatness. Door trim and crown molding detailed in blood. They found used watercolor brushes later. Fingers and toes stored in separate labeled Tupperware containers. Hair wound in intricate spirals and pressed between the pages of relevant books. Alice Ramsey's hair filled the collected works of Lewis Carroll, and Edmund Ramsey's scarce locks decorated a battered copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When they busted Grant Theodore Ramsey, author of All, he put down his algebra homework, smiled, and held out his hands for the cuffs. Later, they found twists of hair from several local missing girls in the pages of his math textbook. Mick's detective went in first. His detective told Ramsey the how and the why of the murders, a speech that would be repeated to the precinct captain, a full court, and several iterations of party guests. As time went on, Mick would nod and corroborate in the right places, though after he would find an excuse to slip his hand around the detective's shoulders or waist. He met the detective 10 years before the Ramsey case. The dislike was sudden, intense, and mutual. For a full 2 years, he solved cases unhindered, which gave him hope that he would be the rare cop who became a detective in their own right. Everyone knew when you became a cop you got two choices: help the detective or hinder the detective. Mick's mother wanted him to become a coroner. Because, honey, you're important to the case, but you probably won't be murdered for character development. His father wanted him to become a lawyer. It's a symbiotic relationship, son. They'll need you just as much as you need them. Neither of his parents ever attempted a foray into detection. Before her marriage, his mother worked as a secretary for a private eye in San Francisco. She still met with some of the fellow former secretaries for an annual brunch. They called themselves the Gal Friday Club. When she returned from these lunches, his mother bemoaned the fates of the women who had married their detectives. Can't imagine why they expected a stable home life. It's not as if marrying a private eye gets you anything other than alcohol abuse, late hours, and fatales up the wazoo. His father owned a hardware store. He lived in constant fear that it would be the site of a murder or a target for a ring of international jewel thieves. Mick didn't know why a ring of international jewel thieves would target a hardware store in Duluth, but he thought best not to ask. The only detective in the family in recent memory was Great Aunt Senga, a minor lady sleuth who had never made headlines outside of Edinburgh. He still read all her case files, slim though they were. She relied on a combination of rational deduction and pretend napping to collar most of her criminals. She was long dead by the time Mick became interested in her exploits, so he had to settle for tea with Great Aunt Senga's companion, Mrs. Tim. Mrs. Tim was happy to discuss his aunt's cases, although she shoved anti-forensic rhetoric into every anecdote. Before tea was over, he asked her if she ever wanted to be a detective in her own right. She sipped her Darjeeling, peered over the rim of the teacup. "It's not the kind of thing one decides, young man," she said as she helped herself to another dusty metaphor. "You're either a detective or you aren't, and forcing it just causes grief. We all have our roles to play. Just be thankful you're not the criminal or the victim." When career day came in first grade, Mick got into a vicious argument with 3 classmates about his intention to be a detective when he grew up. These future ballerinas and baseball players were firm in their assertion that you couldn't choose to be a detective any more than you could choose to have red hair. He punched the ringleader and received detention for the rest of the week, along with a stern lecture on feasible career goals. Mick's detective didn't subscribe to forensic methods, at least not exclusively. All detectives these days paid lip service to forensics at least a little bit. "Did you know," said Mick's detective, "that the word forensics comes from the Latin forensis?" Mick shook his head. They were stretched out on the couch while Mick watched basketball, and the detective read aloud interesting bits from the latest copy of Detective Quarterly. "Forensis means of or before the forum, which refers to the Roman legal system. Essentially, whoever told the most persuasive story won the case. Fascinating," said his detective. Mick murmured in mild interest. When Mick met his detective, he didn't even attempt politeness. Strategically speaking, this was stupid. The kind of cops that didn't help detectives were the kind of cops that ended up in the same dead-end shifts for the rest of their lives, or worse. Much later, his detective would confess to liking the arguments because they helped shape the case. Much, much later, the detective would admit to liking Mick immediately because so many other members of law enforcement took the detective's presence as an excuse to slack. Mick's mother wept when he told her he planned to marry his detective. She still remembered a time when a love interest either died at the hands of the master criminal or turned fatal. Detective couples remained rare. The survival rate of love interests had gone up dramatically in the past decade, though it still wasn't 100% and it never would be. He decided to help his detective on their third case. If they were going to be thrown together, Mick would be useful. He ended up locked in a trunk and nearly suffocated, but his dropped pen led right to the location, so he called it a win. Over the years, he learned to carry lockpicks and small portable power tools with him in order to reduce the amount of time locked in small spaces. He also started carrying small plastic frogs that could be easily dropped or tossed during an abduction. The department insisted on giving him a medal every time he nearly died while helping the detective. The medals were stored in the bottom drawer of their shared dresser, between the detective's favorite winter sweater and Mick's black turtleneck from his Steve McQueen phase. "You're the best policeman I know," said Mick's detective. Mick washed the dishes while the detective dried. "You have to say that," said Mick, who regarded these sudden bursts of compliments as a baffling but pleasant aspect of marriage. "No, really, I mean it. When we first met, You were so smart, it scared me. I was supposed to be solving the case, and there you were questioning every move, and they were good questions." The detective paused to put away a stack of salad plates. "I've never said it, but I was pretty hungry back then. You didn't deserve anger, perhaps the scrutiny, but not the anger," said Mick. He looked at the downcast eyes of the detective and tried to remember a time when he didn't see the toll of unsolved cases and tense shoulders, or hear the screams of the detective when they woke from nightmares of past cases. Back when they first met, the detective seemed to glitter with enthusiasm, smile sharp as a knife, untouchable. He put down the soapy sponge, wiped his hands on his jeans, and pulled the detective to him. His detective clung to him. He could smell lavender dish soap and the Mayfair cigarettes the detective claimed to no longer smoke. "Do you remember the Ramsey case?" asked Mick. The detective chuckled into Mick's shirt collar. "Yeah, first time you bothered to use my name. Would have kissed you right there at the scene if you hadn't looked so sad." That was the first time Mick paused and backtracked. "Up to that moment, I never questioned my desire to put the story together. And then I saw Ramsey, and I didn't want to understand. I just wanted to lock away the bastard." "Nasty fucking piece of work," muttered his detective. "But you went in and you constructed the story anyway. You didn't want to, but you did." The detective nestled deeper into his arms. He could feel their heartbeat and the heartbeat of 100 unsolved cases. He squeezed tighter. Mick started sleeping with the detective like this. The other cops were processing the scene at the Ramsey house, and he went into the backyard to get some air. He smelled the vomit before he saw the detective, doubled over a bed of daffodils. Mick walked over to the detective, waited for them to finish, and then patted them on the back. The detective shuddered. "Do you like music? I never asked. I never ask you about nice things," said the detective. The detective's voice shook. "Yeah, I like music. Jazz, mostly. Some classical. Hardly anything with lyrics," said Mick. The detective let out a soft laugh. "What about you?" The detective stood still for a moment, and then they slipped their hand into Mick's open palm. The detective's gloves were gone, and their hands felt lambskin soft on Mick's fingers. He closed his hand around the detective's, loose enough to allow escape, but firm enough to provide comfort. He said the detective's name. The detective squeezed his fingers and turned to face him. "What's your favorite movie?" asked the detective. Mick told them. "And your favorite book?" Mick told them that too. The questions went on for hours, from crime scene to car to station to car again. Finally, in front of Mick's house, the detective asked their final question. "Have you ever wanted to be a detective?" "Desperately. Once. Not anymore," said Mick. "Good," said the detective. "Would you like to come inside?" asked Mick. The detective did.